Hello my debaucherous darlings, and welcome back to the Gothatect. So this video is a little bit different. I'm coming at you from the future, and this video is going to be the first of a two-part series where I tell you the story about how, with a group of amazing friends, I designed and built a sculpture with the specific intention of burning it to the ground. Now, this first video is going to mostly be focused on the design portion, and the second video will be focused on the build. So I'm really excited for you to come along on this storytime adventure with me. For many years now, I have been an artist and maker in the Burning Man community, and this includes both regionally and nationally. If you're unfamiliar with Burning Man, the best way I can think to describe it is a bunch of artists and makers and movers and shakers all come to the desert and we build a giant city from the ground up, and then a week later it gets torn down. The focus is very much on creating collaborative art and collaborative participatory experiences for everybody involved. Now, there isn't just Burning Man. All over the country there are what are called regional burns, which are essentially local, smaller burns that respond to the local environment, the site that it's on, and engages the local art community. I'm a New Englander, and so our regional burn is up in Bethel, Vermont. It's an event called Firefly. I really love Firefly. It has the same mission and goals that Burning Man does, but it happens in our local New England woods, and I really think it's a very unique experience to build art for a wooded environment. And as a native born and bred New Englander, it's a really beautiful experience to connect with other artists in my community and get to create interesting art every year. Most people, when they think of Burning Man, they think of the man burn. This is the main effigy burn that you see, and at Burning Man, it's the man, and that evening is meant to be an evening of celebration and excitement and exploration. At Firefly, we also do an effigy burn, but it's in the shape of a bug. The second burn that happens at regional burns and as well as Burning Man is what is called Temple burn. Temple is meant to be a more somber burn because the purpose behind Temple is very different than the purpose behind the effigy burn. Temple is a space that's made to be somewhere that people can go and remember those that they've lost and reflect and grieve and come together. It's this beautiful shared space that doesn't have any strict religious or spiritual tones to it. It's just meant to be a space where as a community people can come together and show care for each other and care for themselves and just remember the things that we've gone through, how we've grown, and the people that we've lost. It's a really inclusive structure, and people will often leave writings or offerings at the temple, which is a big part of the experience of it, because as you visit the temple over the course of the event, more and more gets added to it, and you get to meet other people and share and talk about what you might be grieving or growing through. The interesting side of this is because we always burn the temple at the end of the event, it's meant to act as a cathartic event where we're really practicing letting go and living in the moment and not creating something that is meant to stand for a very long time. It's very much about the instantaneous experience and being present. So every year artists will submit proposals to do temple for their regional burns, for Burning Man. And this year I decided to submit a temple design for our regional burn, Firefly. This year felt like the right year to do temple. I felt a strong kinship to the goals of temple. In 2021, I lost my dad to pancreatic cancer, and he was one of the most amazing people that I've ever had the privilege of knowing. He was the person who taught me making and fabricating. He was an artist and machinist himself, and just one of the kindest and most grateful people that I've ever met. And I mourn his loss every single day. Something that he always taught me was to use art and creativity to work through grief. And doing Temple felt like the right thing to be doing. It felt like the right moment in time for me to put out a design for Temple. I think as humans, one of the universal defining emotions that we do unfortunately experience is grief and loss. And I think there is this natural inclination that we have to share and support each other through hard times. And I think with everything that's been happening in the world, we have all experienced way more grief than we should have in our lifetimes. I think grief can often make you feel like you're standing still, and that stillness and stagnation can feel very painful. And so I wanted to experiment with creating a space that felt calm and could be a place that you could be still and sit with your grief and your loss, but it not be something that felt painful. I really wanted the temple to create a space for healing and using stillness as a way to do that. And because of this, the Temple of Stillness was born. Now, I'm going to try to explain my design process. This can get a little bit wibbly, and so I apologize if this is a little hard to follow. The big thing when thinking about trying to create your own design process is to try a bunch of different things. Don't be afraid to think outside the box, create or make or process outside the box. What I do might not work for you, and so don't be afraid to be creative and see what works for you over time. The other piece that I will mention is I do have a background in architecture. I am formally trained as an architectural designer and as an artist, and so my process might be very different and a bit more formalized, but it wasn't always. The big thing is to just experiment, put yourself out there, and don't be afraid to make a mistake. There is no wrong way to be creative. So whenever I start a new design, one of the first things I do is what I call a brain dump. And essentially what this is I will just put on my favorite music and sketch or write or just catalog anything that's going through my brain in that moment. And I try to not be too prescriptive with my thought process. I want to just let the unconscious ideas come through, because I think this is a really good way for my brain to prioritize things. And so it often is a very chaotic process, but it ends up creating a lot of really interesting insights for me. And I like this as a first jumping off point. After I've done the brain dump, I will go through and kind of take stock of what I've done. And the next part of my process is always using that information to actually begin designing. I will sketch, sometimes I create mood boards, sometimes I might create poetry, anything that really helps to get at and begin to understand what the purpose of the design is and where it's coming from. With Temple, one of the interesting things that was coming up for me was the archetypal idea of a sundial. I think we all intuitively are intrigued by the idea of a sundial and the way that it interfaces with light. And I think this was something that I wanted to bring to the design of the temple, because I think inherently understanding that time is passing while you are standing still is a really great way to play with our sense of time. The other beautiful thing about sundials is they're this interesting interplay between a built form and light. And I think architecture often does this exceptionally well. And so I was really excited to experiment and play with this idea of making the temple almost like a giant sundial building. I took this idea of the sundial and I began to run with it. The first things that I started sketching were these series of fin shapes, and I think it was a very interesting way to conceive of how I could play with the changing and movement of light. And one of the things that came up a lot in the design process is the cost of materials. I was very aware that materials are very expensive right now. Because of this, I ended up going with a 6-sided structure. In plan, it looks like an asterisk, and there's a beautiful symbiosis with this design idea because I think our lives have this giant asterisk next to them for the past couple of years, and I think intuitively it created a really balanced shape for the temple. In a lot of ways, it just really felt right, and this is something that I think comes up a lot, the idea of something that feels right in design or in art or when you're being creative. And I don't think there's a right or a wrong. I don't think there's a great way to explain that intuitive feeling that you get. What I will say is if it's something that you aren't experiencing yet, or if your gut doesn't feel strong yet, don't stress it. Just keep doing, just keep creating. That will come over time. My gut intuitively was not always strong either, and I just kept doing, kept making, kept learning. And the more you do this, the stronger your gut will become. I promise you it definitely gets easier over time as you start to get a sense of what your design process and style is like. I think it's a very important thing to learn to just trust the process. Being creative, I think, is an inherently chaotic state of being, and that is completely okay. And I think the chaotic nature of it is actually what's so freeing. And so don't be afraid of it, just trust the process. Now, typically with Temple, historically, the structures are very dense and mostly made of wood because the structure is what's going to be burned. And I knew that because materials and costs were going to be a little bit tighter this year, I really wanted to play with this idea of open space and making what I did include in the temple feel really purposeful and intentional. And I think this is something that is really worth experimenting with in art, in architecture. I think intuitively want to add more, and sometimes less is more. And so playing with void, playing with, defining space with very few members is a really interesting way to design and to think about architecture and space and placemaking. What I ended up doing was creating these intricate CNC cut filigree panels that were going to skin the 6 sides of the asterisk of the structure, as well as creating a CNC filigree designed skylight that would sit over the top center of the temple. The idea of this is I really wanted to play with different types of rendered light. The structure itself had that very regimented 6-sided fin design, but then adding the filigree panels creates this really interesting, beautiful moment for very different shadow types. And I think about this the way leaves will have really beautiful, interesting light and shadow coming through them in the woods. And because Firefly happens in a wooded site, I really believed that this relationship between the temple and rendered light that you see in the woods was going to be a really beautiful, understated moment. I also, very early on, really wanted to experiment with this idea of creating a resin stained glass skylight for the temple. I think stained glass is one of the most beautiful things you can see, and because we often see them attached to spaces that have either a religious architectural significance or are of great importance, borrowing that really lends a certain tone to the architecture of the structure that I'm creating. And I think that's a really handy trick if you're trying to create a sculpture or an art piece or even a performance. Use the things that are around you that lend itself to whatever emotion or experience you're trying to create, because people intuitively already understand things about the built space. And so you can borrow those ideas and mix them into what you're trying to do to create that kind of conversation between what you've made and the person viewing and experiencing it. I also really love the colored light that comes through stained glass, and I really believe that this interplay with light and shadow and color was really going to highlight this sense of time slowly passing in a space that felt beautiful, and therefore the stillness wouldn't feel uncomfortable for people to experience. With all this in mind, I hunkered down, figured out the design, put the budget together, put the proposal together, and I sent it off. And about a month later, we found out that we would be building Temple. Now, I am so incredibly fortunate. I have the best friends who are often on the build crew with me. I've built several large-scale sculptures in the past, and I always include a lot of the friends that I've included for this project, and they're just the best people, and I'm so grateful to them. And this is something that I highly encourage you to do. If you have the opportunity, collaborate with other people. It will make you a better artist and a better designer. Trying to coordinate with other people and see things through their lens is a really useful device to become a better artist, and it makes you a better person. With the design ready to go, it was time to get into the build, but I will save that story for part 2. So go check that video out if you want to see what the end result was. Thank you so much for following along with me on my design process. I know this video is a little bit different, but I hope it inspires you to just get out there and be creative and don't feel like you need to limit yourself. If you want to make sure you're always up to date on all the awesome sculptures and art and DIY we have going on here at the Gothatech, feel free to click subscribe and click the notification bell so you will get notified every time we post more debaucherous creative content here. And if you want to support the channel further, consider checking out our Patreon. We do a really great after show called the Mortem, where we go into more detail about the project itself. And this Mortem is special because we get to talk with the whole crew about building this sculpture. This has been wonderful, darlings. Until next time, be creative, live fully, and memento mori.